So thank you for the segue into what we were doing on these lakes for the past since 2016, looking for wetlands in artificial reservoirs in Kansas. So the second study that we did in 2023, Jennifer Moody was our botanist. Don Huggins and Craig Freeman went in the field with us also, and Jude and Chris Bishop in the back were doing the mapping and putting the pieces together. Okay, so as Don mentioned, we had two studies. The first was in 2016 and 17, looking at the open water wetlands that are forming in the branches of the reservoirs. So you have a branch that's dammed. It's actually rivers coming into it. And along those rivers, we thought, well, we've seen wetlands out there. What is the status of those wetlands? So we kept ourselves out in the open water about 1 meter deep and surveyed the vegetation, also looked at water and sediment, and discovered there's not really that much wetland forming in this open water area. So let's concentrate on the shoreline wetlands. So in this case, we get out, well, Jennifer gets out of the boat and she goes to the shore and does her thing while I stay in the boat and do my thing. So these are both Kansas Water Office grants funded through EPA flow through money, and part of their wetland development management grants, WM, wetland management and development grants. Yeah.
Just a little bit of background is that most states have a wetland protection plan, or are supposed to have EPA funded. In Kansas, that plan is overseen by the Kansas Water Office. Of course, you want to pick one of the state agencies the least qualified to do that, and then give them administrative power to do so. So that's how we get these grants. They're usually either passed through directly to a researcher or through the water office through some kind of system where we meet and prioritize state needs that help meet the plan goals.
Okay, thank you. So Vahid Ramani was here for the first study, and then he was, I think, engineer, GIS person, and then went on to work at K-State, and now has his own consulting business. So I'll go over that. Oh, first, why do we care about wetlands? Well, they're protecting the water that we drink, and Kansas is kind of short on water. Kansas once had 841,000 acres of wetlands, and half of those are gone now. They've been lost through cropland conversion and surface and groundwater depletions. And the reason we need them is that they preserve and enhance water quantity and quality through moderation of extreme precipitation and discharge events, which might be occurring more and more often, people say. They also store sediment and reduce loads into reservoirs and other water sources. And they sequester pollutants and reduce downstream water resource contamination. So Kansas has lost half of their wetlands, but we've gained a lot of lakes. So, and the wetlands are forming in the upper parts of the lakes. So are they really replacing the wetlands that have been lost, and are they functioning? Is their functioning replacing the wetlands? And in order to understand that, first we have to know where the wetlands are. So this was a group effort among the field biologists and the GIS people to map the wetlands and then go out and see, are the wetlands really there? So the first study in 2016 and 17, we looked at these 20 reservoirs, and they're on a map showing the precipitation gradient from southeast Kansas, where we get a lot of rain, up to where there's not much rain in the west. And then the second part of the study, we looked at only 8 of these reservoirs, more or less in a similar precipitation gradient. And these are the 8 lakes with the little red dots in them. So keep in mind that the first study was to look at the open water lakes, open water wetlands. And what we wanted to do is map potential wetland areas in the riverine areas. What I'm calling riverine are where the rivers come in and form these branches. And we also looked at the main basin, the very deep, large area near the dams. And first, the lake extents were mapped by considering water retention time, precipitation, storage area, discharge, evaporation, and other variables. And the GIS people did their magic and made maps showing the normal lake extent is this light blue area. It's the regulation level that the Army Corps uses. It's considered the typical, how much the lakes are typically filled. And then we can, using these variables, we can figure out where high water events will occur. And that's, in other words, flooding occurs. And then where the low water extents are if there's drought or other reasons that there's not water in the dam. Elk City is in that high precipitation area in the southeast. Webster was in the northwest. So you can see when Webster gets dry, it really gets dry. The low water is really out here, which means this is opening up more land. Maybe there's wetland development there. So mapping and GIS was the first component. Second component was actually getting in a boat and going out and sampling the water and sediment and looking for wetlands. These X's are approximate locations of where we went out to collect our samples. And this was our sampling scheme. We had 2 perpendicular transects where we'd have 5 points where we take water samples and composite them into one sample, one jug that got analyzed. We'd look for vegetation along the transects and also take a sediment core at each spot. So this is what it looked like in the field. From the boat, using a Hariba to take in situ water chemistry, which was dissolved oxygen, temperature, turbidity, pH. Also, and then we'd scoop water at the 5 points, put it into one bottle, and send it out for analysis of total organic carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus, which are nutrients, chlorophyll, which likes the nutrients and grows if there's lots of them, chlorophyll from the algae, and then total and volatile suspended solids. And also we take sediment core at each of those 5 spots, take the top 4 centimeters of the sediment and ship it off to analyze for organic carbon, bulk density of the soil, and also particle size, meaning percent silt, sand, and clay in the soil. So this is to give you an overview of what's happening with the nutrients in the water. Remember, this is from the first study, more in the open water. We looked at the main basin near the dam, which is in dark blue, compared to the riverine areas, which I put in brown to represent the turbidity. And as Dawn mentioned, when we first formed our subunit in KBS, the Central Plains Center for Bioassessment, we were charged by the US EPA of taking all the data from Region 7 that we could get a hand on and analyzing it to come up with nitrogen, phosphorus, and chlorophyll values that were guidance for what lakes and streams should be in the area to be functioning well and not over eutrophied. So I put these standard benchmark levels on here. There's one for lakes, one for streams. And what we found are all the samples were, of course, higher than the benchmark levels because there's lots of soil, cropland soil, grassland soil running into the lakes, and that carries the nitrogen and phosphorus from the cropland. Lots of cropland in Kansas. So all the R values were higher than the benchmark values, which were expected. And we found there was higher nutrients and chlorophyll in those upper riverine areas. So that was 20 lakes, where we had 20 main basins that we sampled and 60 branches that we sampled for water. I'm also going to show what we found with the sediment in the main basin versus the riverine areas. So nitrogen and phosphorus were higher in the main basin down by the dam than they were in the riverine areas in the sediment. If we look at proportion of sand, silt, and clay, we see more clay in the river or in the main basin areas. And clay is has a charge to it. Is it negative charge to clay that tends to hang on to the nitrogen and phosphorus in the water? So perhaps the clay that gets carried down to the dam is what is carrying the nitrogen and phosphorus from these riverine areas. We also looked at bulk density that affects plant growth, because the denser the soil is, the more difficult it is for the roots to penetrate. And bulk density was higher up in the riverine areas. So this is some of the data. And then what about the vegetation? So for vegetation, we looked at taxa and percent cover. And we had two methods of looking at the data, or looking at the vegetation. Visual estimate in that perpendicular X that we were working in. So visual estimate of cover and what species were there, but also we wanted to capture the submerged vegetation. So we used the rake method, which the EPA uses. So what it is a rake head attached to a rope, and you throw it out and we drag it along the transect and see what vegetation it captures and what percent of the tines are covered. That's how they estimate percent covered. So most of the time we didn't get anything. Here's an example of Phragmites in Wilson Lake. So we found in the steeper water areas, only 9 of the 20 reservoirs had wetland vegetation. And only 4 of the reservoirs had more than 20% cover in the vegetation. And there were a total of only 5 plant taxa found in the entire study among all 20 lakes. So Wilson had the most. Wilson had 3 species. The Phragmites, Potamogeton, and bulrush. And then 3 lakes had either Persicaria, which is this plant, or coontail. So not much vegetation in those areas. But Jude and others did get a publication out of this. If you want to learn more about the how slope and wind are affecting the lakes and where the wetlands are found, they wrote this paper. And I think the main conclusion was that slope and wind speed and fetch affect where the wetlands are forming. So on to part 2 of the study, where we decided to go to where the wetlands are obviously growing, the shoreline wetlands. And this gives the the ability to refine the mapping, the potential wetland areas. So we went to these 8 lakes. The lakes had 1 to 3 riverine branches, so a total of 18 branches that we went up to look for wetlands. We surveyed over 300 miles of shoreline from the boat, driving around in a boat. And there was 131 wetlands tallied among these reservoirs, and I'll show you how we did that. So I drove the boat, and Jennifer Moody had binoculars and this app called Gaia GPS that showed where we drove in the lakes. This is Hillsdale. And as we drove into each of these branches, she kept track of all the wetlands that she saw and made general notes about percent, the top like 4 or 5 species she saw. Sometimes she got out of the boat to look at it more closely, but as we went on, she was pretty good at remote surveying with binoculars of wetlands. And then in each branch, we actually stopped and got out of the boat and did a more intense inventory of the wetlands. So using this plot frame. So we had the remotely surveyed wetlands, and then this intense one where she used these frames, kept track of taxa and percent cover. And found there were 11 to 47 plant species that we found in each branch. Prairie Lake, the Delaware River branch, had the most species of plants in its wetlands, 47 plant species. So this shows number of plant species 0 to 50. Each lake is coded a different shade. And then like here we have Clinton Lake is the 3 branches are in black. Clinton Lake, Deer Creek had only about 13 plant species. This is Clinton Lake, the Rock Creek branch had about 25, and so on. And these are, she took pictures of each of her frames so that we remembered what she was seeing. Mainly forb, 66% of the vegetation was forbs, 25% graminoids, and 9% woody, and a low coefficient of conservatism. And what that means is these plants like disturbed areas. High conservatism value means it's a plant that doesn't like disturbance. We did find, she found this Carex scoparia red broomstick. I don't know if Craig Freeman was with her, but he was excited that this was found. And that had the highest COC of 7, and that was in the Rock Creek branch of Clinton Lake. So even though it didn't have most number of plants, it did have something that doesn't withstand disturbance. So that tells us about the longevity of these wetlands, because it's low coefficient of conservatism. They like disturbance. These wetlands are being inundated by river fluctuations every year and just aren't very long lasting because of the way the lakes are managed. And then there's a lot more information about than this, but just to give you an idea of proportion of native to non-native wetland plants, mainly native wetland plants found in these reservoirs. However, looking at annual versus perennial, it's kind of split. Clinton has mainly annual plants growing. These other ones have mainly perennial. So that can be maybe an indicator of the longevity of the wetlands or the stability. We had a little side project of visiting the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks willow plantings there's this plant, pretty purple plant called Justicia americana that has been used to stabilize shorelines in other states, Texas and Oklahoma. So wildlife and parks decided, let's go out there and plant these everywhere. So we followed up on the plantings just to see if the water willow was still there. This is Hillsdale Lake. The red are the plantings they did in 2000 through 2002. Blue is what they planted in 2022. So we stopped at every one of these places and found water willow in only 2 places. So we were actually here in the fall of 2022, found 2 areas of the water willow. So the recommendation of that is don't bother planting water willow. So that was an easy study. But we wrote it all in a paper, make it official. It's a pretty plant. Okay, but what did we do to sample these shoreline wetlands? We had the same schematic of the perpendicular transects. However, the site number 1, we only took 1 water sample. We had this site number 1, the point number 1 was out in the water where I took water and sediment and the in situ measurements. And from each of these other sites, 2 to 4 were along the shoreline. They were in the wetland along the shoreline. And 5 was in the center of the wetland polygon. So from all the spots, I took sediment cores. And here you can see the core there. And this is my homemade sediment coring bucket. So we looked at the same variables as the last. And so now I'm taking the data from the previous study. We looked at 20 lakes, but I pulled out only the 8 lakes that we repeated in the 2023 study. So the 2023 study of actually being on solid land on the shoreline, except the water wasn't on the land, the water was in the lake. So that's in bright yellow, the shoreline study. And similar nitrogen as the riverine areas in the previous study, but phosphorus and chlorophyll was higher at the shoreline. And then looking at sediment, how does the sediment from the wetlands compare? I haven't looked at ANOVAs or anything to look at statistical significance yet. Our final report isn't due until December now. So part of the reason for giving this talk was to make myself work on the data before I forget what we did, and to get this at least done. So here we see this, I don't know, it's kind of, the shoreline had more nitrogen in the sediment, about the same phosphorus. And then shoreline had a lot more sand than out in the more open water. I don't know if there's anything surprising here with the data, or like the bulk density is about the same as the previous study. So I might have, well, Jennifer Moody's gonna have to look at this. I'll pick her brain about what all the variables mean for the plants. But an additional thing we're doing with this study is looking at how wind affects the location of the wetlands. So Chris Bishop gave me this graphic. Kansas, the winds in Kansas are primarily from the south or south-southwest. So they're blowing up toward the north. So the theory is that most of the wetlands are going to be along the north shores of the lakes. And this is called a windrows. It's the compass directions showing where the wind is blowing from and the strength of the wind. So dark red is stronger, blue is lighter winds. This is from El Dorado, a weather station near El Dorado Lake. So more localized. and it's also from just the growing season. We see strong southerly winds during the growing season. So the idea is to, if we can superimpose these wind roses on each lake, see where the wind's blowing from and where are these wetlands forming. So I guess Chris and Jude will be mapping the wetland polygons and seeing how everything lines up. If you have questions about it, you can ask them. They're right here. Oh, and I wanted to point out when we surveyed the branches, we wanted to stay away from the influence of the main basin. So these yellow lines are actual survey links, looking for wetlands. And then up here, you can see where we hit a bridge. And then beyond the bridge is usually too shallow. Very wetlandy up here, too shallow to get up there. But these dots are everywhere we found a wetland. So another step of this, oh, I wanted to show this. This is a cool thing. This is Field Maps app, and they put together the GIS layers in a thing, in an app that we can use on our phone while we're out there, and it's available. Anyone can access it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have an ArcGIS on my.
If you, yeah.
But it's mobile, so you don't have to have a connection.
Yeah.
Your GIS map download.
Yeah, it downloads to your phone. And then when you're out there, you can see where you are. And you also get the lake extents. So the conservation pool for El Dorado, the flood pool is the bright yellow line. You can see where the trees are. These are I think 1 foot elevation lines, topo lines. And what I showed on did I show this? Oh, okay. So we did find there's a wetland in this divot where this little trickle of the stream is coming in. But another step is to take the NWI, National Wetlands Inventory, which I guess is known to not be so accurate anymore. But I mean, it could be updated with our surveys. This is, oh, I forget what year they used. This is from the 80s, probably, they mapped this. The green polygons are where they mapped wetlands previously. The yellow dot is where we found our wetland. This is in El Dorado. It was a very dry year. You can see that the water is very low, exposing a lot of shoreline. And we were there where we found our wetland, which is normally underwater. So, so we're going to look at the wetland NWI polygons. They're going to look more into wind shear stress, if that's affecting or influencing the locations. And I want to look more at the relationships among the soil and vegetation variables. So, oh, okay. And these are my extra pictures that I wanted to include, but I didn't have a place. There's a Craig sighting. El Dorado is really cool. There's lots of, I should have shown the live mussel. There's lots of live mussels scooching around. That was really fun to see. Oh dear. Oh, and this is from, leftover from the 2019 flood. You guys know what these are? Zebra mussels way up in the trees.
Wow.
That shows how deep the water was in 2019. So that was kind of cool to see. And this is how Jennifer surveyed them. So that's an overview of just inventorying wetlands and refining mapping techniques and going out there and looking for them, seeing what's going on.